Welcome to Dor Lador, Jewish History and Culture. Dor Lador means from generation to generation, and that is precisely the journey we are on. Join us as we travel across centuries and continents to uncover the remarkable people, places, traditions, and ideas that built Jewish civilization. From ancient roots to modern realities, this is where the Jewish story comes alive.
Imagine for a second that you wake up tomorrow morning and the absolute center of your entire world has just been vaporized.
Right. Like completely wiped off the map.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't just mean like your capital city, though that's obviously gone.
Yeah.
I mean the physical headquarters of your government, the absolute center of your banking and economic system, the sole location where you're allowed to practice your highest spiritual devotion.
All of it gone in a flash.
Right. The place where your culture's most sacred heritage is physically kept. Imagine if, Wall Street, the Vatican, the U.S. Capitol building, and the Smithsonian were all somehow contained in one single complex.
Which is hard to even wrap your head around today.
It is. And then imagine all that was just wiped out in a single cataclysmic fire. I mean, how does a society even begin to survive something like that?
Well, it's a level of sudden, absolute devastation that most of us can't even fully process. You're basically describing the complete and total erasure of a civilization's operating system.
Wow. Yeah, the operating system.
Yeah, because when the physical anchors of a society are violently removed like that, the natural historical trajectory is just, extinction.
Right, they just disappear.
Exactly. The people scatter, they assimilate into whatever empire conquered them, or they simply fade into the footnotes of history. We've seen it happen to, countless ancient civilizations.
But so today in this deep dive, we're going to look at a society that didn't fade away. We're tracking one of the most massive historical pivots in human history.
And it really is a massive pivot.
It is. It's the transition of Judaism from a highly centralized, localized, temple and sacrifice-based system into this decentralized, global, prayer-based system.
Which was a completely radical shift.
Totally radical. And the wild part for you listening today is that we can actually trace the blueprint for this massive societal reinvention through the life of just one man.
Yes. Rabbi Akiva ben Joseph.
Right. So let me give you all a quick high-level summary here, because his resume is absolutely unbelievable.
It really is staggering when you lay it all out.
Oh, that's insane. So Rabbi Akiva was a completely uneducated shepherd until he's 40 years old, which in the ancient world is well past middle age.
Right. Then he just decides to learn to read. He becomes a monumental legal scholar, and he essentially categorizes this vast, unstructured web of ancient oral traditions.
Earning him the title of the father of the Mishnah. Yeah.
Exactly, the first major written collection of Jewish oral traditions. He builds this massive flagship academy near modern-day Tel Aviv. He ends up backing a doomed, fiery rebellion against the Roman Empire, and he ultimately dies a horrific martyr's death.
Setting the standard for religious resilience for the next 2 millennia.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand why Akiva was so revolutionary, we really first have to visualize the world he was born into, a world that, frankly, was about to be violently erased.
That's the key, yeah.
Yeah.
You really can't appreciate the medicine until you understand the disease.
So let's set the scene and look at the religious and political landscape during the first 20 years of Akiva's life, roughly 50 to 70 CE. So Akiva is born in a town called Ancient Lydda, which is modern-day Lod. It's located in central Israel today, not too far from the modern airport, actually.
Okay.
And he's born into a very low-income family. In the terminology of his day, he's a commoner, a simple laborer who doesn't know the religious laws.
He's just a regular working class guy.
Exactly. And during this specific era, everything, and I mean absolutely everything in the Jewish world, revolves around one specific piece of geography.
Temple Mount.
Yes, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem.
Right. And when we say religion in this era, I want you, the listener, to completely strip away your modern conceptions of, like, reading books in quiet study halls or meditating silently.
Oh, absolutely. It was nothing like that.
Everyday devotion in Akiva's youth was not about sitting in a pew reading a text. It was physical. It was loud. It was visceral.
Highly visceral. I mean, if you were an ancient history student walking into Jerusalem in the year 60 CE, you would be totally overwhelmed by the sensory experience.
Just the sights and the smells.
Yeah, because the core of the religion was the sacrificial system. Worship literally meant physical sacrifices.
Like animals?
Right, we're talking about animal sacrifices. Bulls, sheep, goats, doves. And this was alongside massive grain offerings and wine libations poured directly onto a massive stone altar.
So it's essentially a giant, loud slaughterhouse right in the middle of the city.
Basically, yeah. You would smell roasting meat, burning incense, spilled wine. You would hear the chanting of psalms from the Levite choirs. This wasn't something just anyone could do. It was entirely managed and performed by a hereditary, aristocratic class of priests. If you weren't born into that specific bloodline, you simply could not perform the core rituals of your own faith. You can bring an animal to the temple, sure, but a priest had to be the one to actually offer it.
Right. And it was incredibly centralized, too. 3 times a year, you had these massive pilgrimage festivals.
The big 3.
Yeah. And during these 3 festivals, hundreds of thousands of Jews from all across the Mediterranean basin.
From Egypt, from Italy, from Babylonia.
They all just packed their bags and flocked to this one single city, Jerusalem.
It was an incredible logistical and economic undertaking when you think about it. People traveled for weeks, sometimes months, to offer their tithes, to bring their sacrifices, and to participate in this highly unified civic and religious culture.
Which must have been a huge boost to the local economy.
Oh, Jerusalem's economy was essentially built around this massive influx of religious tourism.
Right.
The temple functioned not just as a religious center, but as a national bank where funds were stored, a Supreme Court where the highest laws were decided, and, like you said, a slaughterhouse.
So think about this for a second. It's like putting all of your cultural, political, and spiritual eggs in one single, highly combustible basket.
Very combustible.
Right. I mean, imagine if your entire national identity, your economic system, and your spiritual salvation were literally locked inside one single building. But hold on, let me stop and look at this logically.
Sure.
You're describing hundreds of thousands of people marching to Jerusalem 3 times a year.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like everyone is marching in perfect, unified harmony. But whenever you have that much money and power centralized in one place, you usually get, well, massive corruption and division.
Oh, inevitably.
So was everyone actually on the same page here, or was this a deeply divided society?
Oh, it was incredibly fractured. It was a very fragile ecosystem. Underneath the spectacle of the temple, Judaism at that time was split into intensely competitive theological and political factions.
Okay, who were the major players?
Well, there were 3 main groups that really dominated the landscape, and they pretty much despised each other. First, you had the Sadducees.
Right, the temple guys.
Exactly. These were the wealthy, aristocratic, priestly class. They were the ones who actually controlled the temple operations. Theologically, they were strict literalists.
Meaning they only cared about the written law.
Right. They believed you must strictly follow the literal, plain text of the written biblical laws, and they entirely rejected the concept that there were any valid, unwritten, oral traditions.
They sound like the ultimate establishment party, like the old money, who just want to keep the rules exactly as they are because the current rules keep them in power.
That's a very accurate way to look at it, actually. Then, on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you had the Essenes.
Who were they?
These were radical, ascetic, apocalyptic groups who essentially looked at the wealthy Sadducees running the temple in their fine robes, collaborating with the Roman occupiers, and said, this whole system is entirely corrupt, the temple is defiled. So the Essenes literally withdrew into the desert, like the community at Qumran, where the famous Dead Sea Scrolls were eventually discovered.
Ah, right, the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah. They lived out there as doom preachers, sharing all their property communally, washing in ritual baths, and just waiting for a cosmic war at the end of days.
So you have the wealthy establishment elites controlling the city center, and you've got these radical ascetics hiding out in the desert caves writing apocalyptic scrolls. It feels very extreme.
It was a very polarized time.
Who's the third group?
The third major group were the Pharisees. These were the populist scribes and scholars who operated more among the common people in the towns and marketplaces.
They were more grassroots.
Exactly. They championed the oral traditions, the unwritten laws and customs passed down verbally that interpreted and expanded upon the written text. They also believed in concepts like the resurrection of the dead and the afterlife, which the wealthy Sadducees completely rejected. But most importantly, The Pharisees were deeply focused on adapting the ancient laws for everyday common people, not just for the elite priests in the temple.
And this is the group that Rabbi Akiva would eventually align with, right?
Yes, this is the group he joins and fundamentally transforms.
Right. And this fragile, deeply divided ecosystem, with the Sadducees holding the physical power and the money, the Essenes preaching doom in the desert, and the Pharisees trying to reach the commoners in the streets, this entire powder keg was about to collide head-on with the greatest superpower of the ancient world.
The Roman Empire.
The Roman Empire.
Yes. Tensions over taxation, cultural disrespect, and political control finally boil over. The Great Jewish Revolt against Rome begins in 66 CE, and it culminates in an absolute catastrophe in the year 70 CE.
And this is the big one.
This is the rupture. The Roman legions, under the command of the future Emperor Titus, besiege Jerusalem. It's a brutal, starvation-inducing siege.
Just horrific conditions inside the city.
Unimaginable. And finally, they breach the walls, they level the city, and they burn the Second Temple to the ground.
The absolute center of their universe just vaporized.
And the historical consequences are immediate, brutal, and totally decisive.
Because the whole system was tied to that one building.
Exactly. When the temple burns, the Sadducees, that wealthy, literalist, priestly class, they lose their entire power base. Without a physical temple, they have no function, no authority, and frankly, no source of wealth.
So they're just done.
They quite literally vanish from the historical record. The hereditary priests are completely sidelined. The central mechanism for Jewish worship, the sacrifices, is gone.
That's a total existential crisis. So the Sadducees are wiped out. The Essenes in the desert eventually fade away or just destroyed by the Roman legions marching through.
Right.
But what happens to the Pharisees? Because if you're a Pharisee, your first thought isn't let's sit down and write books. Your first thought is probably how do we eat? How do we survive the Roman purges? And how do we organize?
Yeah, mere survival was a priority. The surviving Pharisaic sages, the scholars, managed to flee the destruction.
I read somewhere they had to sneak out.
So they relocate to a small coastal town called Yavne, which is modern-day Yavne in central Israel, and they convene there to try to literally save the religion from total extinction.
It is arguably the ultimate crisis management meeting in human history. And what they do in Yavne over the next few decades is nothing short of miraculous.
It really is.
They completely redesign the operating system of the faith. To use a modern term, they democratize it.
Democratization is the perfect word for it, actually. They realize that the old centralized aristocratic model is dead and buried under Roman rubble. So they execute a massive structural shift across 3 distinct areas of daily life.
Okay, let's go through these.
First, they shift from physical action to liturgy.
Because they literally can't sacrifice animals anymore.
Yeah.
Right, it wasn't just a preference. It was against their own biblical law to build an altar outside of Jerusalem.
Right, it's strictly forbidden to offer a sacrifice outside the designated sanctuary, which, again, is now a pile of smoldering rubble.
Right.
So the shedding of animal blood on an altar is replaced by prayer, along with fasting, repentance, and acts of communal charity.
They swap the physical for the verbal.
Exactly. And they take the daily prayers, and they standardize them to correspond exactly to the specific times of the day that the old morning and afternoon animal sacrifices used to be offered on the temple altar.
That is just brilliant psychological engineering. They are mapping the new virtual system directly onto the muscle memory of the old physical system.
That's exactly what they're doing.
It reminds me, honestly, of the shift to remote work during the recent COVID lockdowns. We couldn't physically go to the office water cooler or the boardroom anymore, so what did we do?
We got on our computers.
Right. We didn't abandon the concept of the meeting. We just virtualized it into a Zoom call at the exact same time the physical meeting used to happen.
Yeah.
We maintained the temporal structure even though the physical space was gone.
That's a fantastic analogy. They kept the schedule but changed the medium.
So what was the second shift?
The second massive shift they made at Yavne was moving from a physical space to a concept. Before 70 CE, the ultimate sacred space was the Temple Mount. Now, the local gathering place, the synagogue, becomes the new micro-sanctuary.
Okay.
The sages declare that holiness is no longer confined to one single building in Jerusalem. Holiness can now be generated in any room, anywhere in the world, provided 10 adults gather together to read the text and pray.
So it becomes completely portable. You can take this highly localized religion, pack it into a scroll, and take it with you on a boat to anywhere.
Anywhere at all.
And what is the third shift?
The third shift is moving from bloodline to brain power. Before the catastrophe, religious leadership was entirely dependent on genetics being born into the hereditary priesthood.
The Sadducees.
Right. If you were an uneducated shepherd like our young Akiva, you had zero path to religious leadership. Your DNA dictated your destiny.
You were locked out.
Completely. But at Yavne, authority transitions from hereditary priests to ordained scholars. Leadership becomes an intellectual meritocracy based entirely on your literacy, your logical reasoning, and your mastery of the legal traditions.
If we step back and look at the bigger picture here, this massive three-part shift action to prayer, temple to synagogue, bloodline to brain power, that is the exact mechanism that allowed Judaism to survive anywhere in the world.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, yes, absolutely.
Whether you were living in Alexandria in Egypt or Rome in Italy or Babylonia in the modern-day Iraq, you didn't need a massive stone temple anymore. You just needed a text, 10 people, and a scholar.
Exactly. They built a decentralized network that was virtually indestructible provided you had the software to run it.
Right, but that is the million-dollar question. Who is actually going to write the software for this new decentralized operating system?
Someone had to do it.
Yeah, because you mentioned earlier that the oral traditions were just unwritten customs. It was a chaotic, disorganized mess. They needed someone with a radically new way of thinking to organize all of it so it could actually be taught and transmitted.
They needed an architect.
Enter our unlikely hero, Rabbi Akiva. Let's dive into his beginnings. Because they're so deeply humble, it almost sounds like a fable.
Extremely humble. As we mentioned, he's born around 50 CE in ancient Lydda, modern Lod. He comes from a low-income family. There are even some ancient traditions suggesting his family may have descended from converts to Judaism, which would make him a true outsider.
Wow, really starting from the bottom.
Yes. And for the first 40 years of his life, he is completely illiterate. He works as a simple shepherd. He is the quintessential commoner.
So he lives through the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE as a young man of about 20. He watches his whole world burn.
He sees it all happen.
The economy collapses, the religious center is destroyed, and for the next 20 years, he is just a shepherd. He can't read the Torah. He can't participate in these elite scholarly debates happening over in Yavne.
He's totally disconnected from that intellectual world.
And then around the year 90 CE, when he is 40 years old, he has this incredible epiphany.
It's one of the most famous and I think psychologically poignant stories in rabbinic literature. The tradition tells us that Akiva is out shepherding and he stops at a local well.
Yeah.
He notices a heavy solid stone near the water, and it has a deep, smooth hole carved right through it. He looks closer and realizes that the hole wasn't chiseled by a tool. It was carved by persistent, single drops of water falling constantly over a long period of time.
So drip, drip, drip.
Exactly. And he reasons with himself. If soft water can alter solid, impenetrable stone just through sheer persistence, then surely the iron-like words of the divine text can eventually penetrate and soften his own hardened, uneducated mind.
I really want to pause and push on the psychology of this moment.
Yeah, it's profound.
Because how often do we think we are just too old to learn a new skill today? Maybe we think we're too old to learn coding or a new language. But think about the psychological hurdle here for Akiva. You are 40 years old in the ancient world, an era where average life expectancies were much lower.
40 was a very hard age back then.
Right. 40 isn't just middle age. For a common laborer, your life is heavily worn down. You are completely illiterate, and you decide to basically go to kindergarten.
That's exactly what he did.
The humiliation of a grown man, a rush shepherd sitting down with little children to learn the alphabet, must have been immense. He didn't do this in a vacuum, right? He must have had an incredible support system.
He did. The tradition heavily credits his wife, Rachel.
Ah, Rachel.
Yes. She was actually the daughter of a very wealthy man, one of the richest in Jerusalem, but she chose to marry Akiva, the poor shepherd, because she saw his underlying brilliance and character.
Oh, wow. So she married way out of her social class.
She did, and her father actually disowned her and cut her off financially for marrying him, so they lived in abject poverty.
That's brutal.
Yet she is the one who encourages him to leave his work and go study. So this grown man, at 40 years old, goes and literally sits alongside young children to learn the Hebrew alphabet.
Incredible.
He starts with A and B, or rather, Aleph and Bet, But because of his brilliant mind, his life experience, and his sheer persistence, he rapidly progresses. He doesn't just catch up, he completely laps everyone.
I mean, he's got 40 years of real-world grit behind him.
Exactly. Eventually, he moves on to study under the greatest masters of the surviving Yavna generation.
And once Akiva actually learns to read the text, he doesn't just memorize it like a good, obedient student. He completely, fundamentally reinvents how the text is read.
He revolutionizes it.
By the year 95 CE, so just a few years into his scholarly career, he has attained this massive mastery. He's ordained as a scholar. He's even going on high-level diplomatic missions, traveling to Rome, stopping in places like Puteoli, modern-day Pozzuoli, in Italy, to advocate for Jewish civil rights with the Roman authorities.
Shepard becomes a diplomat.
And then he sets up his own academy.
Yes, he establishes his flagship academy in ancient Bnei Brak, which is situated just east of modern-day Tel Aviv. And this academy becomes the absolute intellectual powerhouse of the Jewish world. He attracts thousands of students.
Thousands.
Yeah, and this is where he begins his monumental life's work. Remember, the oral traditions at this time were just an unstructured web of memorized, disparate rulings. A teacher might recite a law about agriculture, followed immediately by a law about marriage, followed by a law about property damage, purely based on who said the law, with no thematic overarching organization.
It's just a massive brain dump of ancient case law. I mean, imagine trying to learn American law, but instead of having textbooks on constitutional law or contract law, you just had a guy reciting random court cases in chronological order.
It would be impossible to search or apply. It was
Right.
completely unsustainable. Akiva systematically takes this chaotic web and categorizes the laws into thematic streams. He creates distinct logical categories for family law, for civil damages, for agriculture, for holy things.
He builds the structure.
Yes. This organizational methodology is exactly the architecture that was used decades later by his intellectual descendants to officially redact and publish the Mishnah, the first major written redaction of the oral traditions.
Wow.
That's why Akiva is known as the father of the Mishnah. He built the filing cabinet that saved Jewish law from being lost to memory.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, because the way Akiva actually interpreted the law inside his new academy caused a massive methodological schism.
Oh, a huge debate.
He gets into this intense intellectual rivalry with another great sage, Rabbi Ishmael, and the debate between them is fundamentally about how do you decode a divine text?
Right. It's a foundational debate over legal epistemology. How do we know what we know, and how far can a judge stretch the text? Rabbi Ishmael represented the more conservative, logical, traditional approach. His famous operating principle was the text speaks in human language.
Meaning, it's just a book written using standard everyday grammar.
Exactly. Ishmael argued that the biblical text uses standard human idioms, grammatical doubles, and conversational filler just for emphasis and flow.
Like how we use filler when we talk.
Right. For example, in biblical Hebrew, you often have double verbs, which translates literally to open, you shall open, but just means you shall surely open. Ishmael says this is just standard Hebrew syntax. It carries no extra hidden legal weight. You shouldn't invent new laws just because a word is repeated.
But Akiva looks at the exact same text and says, no way. Akiva's approach is this radical microexegesis.
Microexegesis, exactly.
He argues that because the text is entirely divine, dictated by the creator of the universe, there is absolutely zero redundancy. God does not need to use conversational filler. Therefore, every single extra letter, every grammatical repetition, every weird stylistic flourish is a deliberate, intentional legal cipher waiting to be decoded. If the text doubles a word, it is doing so to explicitly instruct the jurist to expand the law to an entirely new category of cases.
The debate over the Hebrew grammatical particle et.
Right, explain this for the listener, because et is a very weird word in Hebrew.
In Hebrew grammar, the word et is simply a particle that indicates a definite direct object. It has absolutely no independent meaning on its own. It's just a grammatical pointer.
It's like the word the in English, but even less meaningful on its own. It just points to the noun that is receiving the action of the verb.
Precisely. So in the biblical book of Deuteronomy, there is a commandment that translates to, you shall fear at the Lord your God. Now, Rabbi Ishmael looks at this and says, great, fear God. The word et is just there because that is how standard Hebrew grammar works.
But Akiva sees the word et, and his eyes light up.
Akiva argues that the word et is superfluous. God could have phrased the sentence without it, and the meaning would still be totally clear. Therefore, its inclusion must mean something profound.
So what does he do with it?
Akiva claims the word et was placed there intentionally to include an additional category of reverence. He uses that tiny, seemingly meaningless grammatical particle to legally expand the commandment of fearing God to include scholars.
Wait, really?
Yes. He extends a commandment exclusively reserved for the divine to encompass the human transmitters of the law.
Okay, I have to push back hard on this. That is incredibly audacious. He's taking a completely unnoticeable grammar rule, basically a typo or a grammatical filler, and using it to mandate profound reverence for his own profession.
It does sound that way, doesn't it?
He is a scholar, and he's finding a grammatical loophole to say, you must treat people like me with the reverence you show God. Isn't that incredibly self-serving? It sounds like the ultimate cult leader move to consolidate his own power.
It absolutely sounds that way on the surface, and Rabbi Ishmael strongly critiqued this exact methodology for that very reason.
Ishmael saw right through it.
Ishmael cautioned that treating purely grammatical elements as legal fonts would lead to arbitrary, endless overexpansion of the law, subject entirely to the whims of the rabbi. He felt it bordered on theological error to equate the reverence of God with the reverence of human scholars.
Slippery slope.
But to defend Akiva here, it wasn't about his personal ego. He was trying to establish the absolute authority of the scholars because, without the temple, the scholars were the only thing holding the entire civilization together.
Ah, I see.
If the people didn't respect the scholars as the ultimate arbiters of truth, the decentralized network would collapse into chaos.
That makes a lot of sense. He's not protecting his own ego, he's protecting the chain of transmission. And honestly, this microexegesis, it reminds me of modern computer coding.
How so?
Well, in a novel, if you add an extra comma, no one really cares, it's just style. But in a line of code, a single misplaced comma or a rogue semicolon changes the entire function of the software. It can crash the whole program or open up an entirely new command. Akiva is basically reading the ancient text like it's source code.
What's fascinating here is that that is a brilliant way to frame it. He is treating the text as divine code. And this wasn't just a party trick. He was giving his colleagues an incredibly fluid, interpretive tool set.
Because they needed to adapt, right?
Right. Without a centralized temple, the Jewish people were moving into new centuries, facing completely new, unprecedented geopolitical and social situations. If the law was rigid and literal like the Sadducees had wanted, it would snap and break under the pressure of Roman exile.
It would just shatter.
But Akiva's methodology allowed the scholars to find legal basis for new adaptive laws hiding right there in the ancient text. It made the system elastic enough to survive the future.
But it wasn't just a free-for-all where Akiva expanded the law wildly whenever he felt like it. He also knew how to logically constrain the law when necessary, which we see perfectly in his intense debates with another contemporary, Rabbi Tarfon.
Tarfon was an older, very wealthy priest, what they call a Kohen. He came from the aristocratic establishment back in Lydda, representing the traditionalist elite practice. Remember, Akiva was a poor, uneducated shepherd from that very same town.
So they knew each other's background.
Yeah. Early in their lives, Tarfon wouldn't have given Akiva a second glance. But now, post-destruction, they are peers in the academy debating law.
The classic matchup. The wealthy establishment traditionalist versus the scrappy, self-taught populist. And they have this massive, complex debate about restitution for civil damages, specifically regarding farm animals.
Yes, the text records a dispute regarding an ox that causes damage. Specifically, they were debating what happens if an ox causes unusual damage on public property versus causing damage on private property.
Okay, lay out the legal context for us. Give us an everyday analogy.
In ancient tort law, the base rule states that if an ox causes unusual, unexpected damage in a public domain, say it gores someone in the middle of the town square, the owner of the ox pays half damages to the victim. Because in a public space, everyone assumes a certain level of shared risk.
Makes sense.
Now, Rabbi Tarfon utilizes a logical deduction. You argue from a minor premise to a major premise. Tarfon reasons. If an ox causes damage on public property where the owner has less responsibility and pays half damages, then if that same ox wanders onto someone's private property where the owner has a much higher duty of care to protect the victim's domain, logically, the penalty should escalate.
Okay, I follow that.
So Tarfon says the owner should pay full damages.
From a purely logical standpoint, Tarfon makes total sense. To put it in modern terms, if I accidentally ding your car door in a crowded public parking lot, maybe we split the cost. But if I drive my car directly into your private driveway and crash into your closed garage door, I should pay the full penalty because I invaded your private sanctuary.
Right. The logic is very sound. Logically, the penalty should escalate based on the severity of the location. What is Akiva's pushback?
Akiva counters Tarfon by invoking a strict structural rule of limitation called dio, which literally translates to "it is sufficient." The principle of dio dictates that a conclusion derived from a logical deduction cannot be more stringent than the original base law from which it was derived.
Wait, explain that a bit more. How does he apply that to the ox?
Akiva argues that the biblical base law for this specific category of unusual damage explicitly limits the liability to half damages. Period.
Okay.
Tarfon is trying to use human logic to escalate the penalty to full damages. So while Akiva uses that tiny word "et" to wildly expand the law in terms of theology and respect for scholars, when it comes to actual civil penalties, when it comes to taking people's hard-earned money in a court of law, he uses strict textual guardrails to limit judicial activism. He's prioritizing structural, textual consistency over intuitive, escalating penalties.
He's protecting the civil legal code from subjective escalation by judges. And this philosophical difference between Akiva and Tarfon, this tension over what is practically necessary versus what the text dictates, eventually comes to a head in one of the most important crisis meetings in post-temple history.
The Council of Lydda.
Yes, the Council of Lydda.
Okay, picture this scene. You have the leading sages gathered in the upper chamber of a house in Lydda. They are trying to figure out how to survive. The temple is gone, they are living under harsh Roman occupation, the economy is shattered, and poverty is rampant.
It's a very dark time.
And the question on the table is an existential operational question. What is more important for the ultimate survival of this society? Steady intellectual engagement with the texts or action, the practical execution of deeds and charity.
It is a profound socio-theological debate that every civilization faces in a crisis. Rabbi Tarfon and the more practical elites argue that action is greater.
Right.
Practical implementation of the commandments, physical charity, civic reconstruction, feeding the starving poor, burying the dead. These practical physical deeds must take precedence to ensure the immediate societal survival of the people.
Which, again, makes total rational sense. If your house is literally burning down, you grab a bucket of water.
Yeah.
You don't sit down at your desk and read a book about the physics of thermodynamics.
Exactly.
Tarfon is saying people are suffering under Rome right now. We need action. But Akiva stands up and says, no, study is greater.
And Akiva wins the debate with a brilliant overarching synthesis. He convinces the council by stating study is greater because study leads to action.
It's like arguing whether you should focus on building a physical life raft or studying a navigation manual. Tarfon says, build the raft, our ship is sinking.
Right.
But Akiva convinces them that without the navigation manual, the life raft just floats aimlessly, and eventually, everyone dies of starvation at sea anyway. The text is the compass. If you lose the knowledge of why you are doing the actions will eventually cease to exist.
That is a perfect analogy. And this was a pivotal legal philosophical victory. By prioritizing text study over mere physical action, Akiva ensured that even if the people lost the ability to physically perform certain geographically dependent commandments, like agricultural laws specific to the land of Israel or temple sacrifices, the intense intellectual engagement with those laws kept the legal matrix alive in their minds in perpetuity.
They virtualized it.
They virtualized the action into the study of the action. To study the laws of the temple sacrifice was deemed spiritually equivalent to actually offering the sacrifice.
And what's amazing is that we actually see this virtualization happen in real time, right in the living rooms of regular families. This obsession with text wasn't just some high-minded theoretical debate for the scholars in the academy.
Oh, not at all.
It fundamentally changed how regular, everyday people celebrated their holidays and educated their children. And the most striking, universally recognizable case study of this is the evolution of Passover.
Passover experienced arguably the most dramatic transformation of any ancient religious practice during this era. To appreciate what Akiva and his contemporaries did, we really have to remind ourselves what Passover looked like before 70 CE.
Right, in the pre-70 CE paradigm, Passover was strictly a pilgrimage festival. You traveled to Jerusalem, and the core of the holiday was a massive state-sponsored animal sacrifice, the Passover lamb.
It was a logistical marvel. Tens of thousands of lambs were physically slaughtered in the temple courts by the hereditary priests.
Tens of thousands.
Yeah. The blood was systematically dashed against the massive stone altar in an assembly line fashion. Then, families would take their slaughtered lamb, roast it whole, and eat it in a massive barbecue within the walled boundaries of Jerusalem on the night of the 14th of the spring month of Nisan.
That's a huge operation.
The city would have been choked with smoke from thousands of roasting fires.
And what about the matzah, the unleavened bread, and the bitter herbs that are so famous today?
Well, in the temple era, the unleavened bread and the bitter herbs were basically just side dishes. They were consumed purely as accompaniments to the main event, which was the roasted meat of the lamb. The entire sensory experience was about the physical sacrifice in that specific geographic location.
But then the Romans destroy the temple, and suddenly the scholars have a massive, seemingly unsolvable problem. Post-70 CE, eating a sacrificial lamb outside of the Jerusalem temple was strictly forbidden by biblical law. You cannot build a makeshift altar in your backyard in Alexandria or Rome. It's a capital religious offense. Yeah. So how do you celebrate Passover when you have no lamb and you have no Jerusalem? Does the holiday just cease to exist?
This is where the absolute genius of the Avna sages, heavily influenced by Akiva's focus on text, shines. They innovate, they create what we now call the Seder.
The Seder, which literally translates to order.
Yes. They take the holiday out of the ruined temple courts and place it squarely onto the dining room tables of individual homes across the global diaspora. The home table functions as a micro-sanctuary.
Okay.
And to structure the evening, the sages actually borrow and adapt a format their people were very familiar with in the broader culture, the Greco-Roman symposium.
I love this detail. Because when we think of an ancient symposium, we usually think of Greek philosophers in togas, reclining on couches, drinking wine, and debating politics or the nature of love.
Precisely. A symposium was a formal, upper-class banquet featuring multiple cups of wine, structured courses of food, and most importantly, structured philosophical discussion led by a host.
Sounds like a pretty good dinner party.
It was. The rabbis cleverly adopt this familiar cultural form, but they completely subvert its content. Instead of reclining and debating Greek philosophy, the worship shifts entirely from physical action slaughtering a lamb to verbal recitation.
The command to tell your child the story of the escape from slavery in Egypt becomes the main event. This text, this structured script for the evening, is what we now call the Haggadah, which literally means the telling.
Storytelling essentially replaces the physical sacrifice, but they also need a way to maintain a psychological connection to the lost temple without violating the strict law against unauthorized sacrifices.
What do they do?
They institutionalize symbolic placeholders on what eventually evolves into the modern Seder plate.
The visual reminders.
Exactly. First, the physical lamb is replaced by a roasted shank bone placed on the table. But the rabbis make it explicitly clear. It is not to be eaten. It serves purely as a visual memorial, a ghost of the original sacrifice.
And they add a roasted egg, right?
Yes. A roasted egg is added to commemorate the festival peace offering that used to be brought alongside the lamb during the temple era.
And what happens to the side dishes? The unleavened bread and the bitter herbs.
Because the lamb is gone, the unleavened bread and the bitter herbs are elevated in status. They are no longer secondary accompaniments to meat. They become independent primary biblical commandments. The unleavened bread becomes the central physical focus of the evening's blessings.
And Akiva has a very specific, crucial addition to this new story pairing text, right? The historical texts record his exact input into how the evening must conclude.
Yes. The sages are structuring how the story should be told. Akiva insists that the text of the Haggadah must explicitly conclude with a blessing that looks forward to future geopolitical redemption and the physical rebuilding of Jerusalem.
This raises a really important question for me.
Yeah.
If you and your colleagues have just spent decades successfully virtualizing the religion, if you've proven that you can survive through text and study without a physical temple, why are you forcing every single family at the end of their meal to pray for the physical rebuilding of the city? Isn't that moving backward?
It seems contradictory, but Akiva understood the immense psychological danger of the new system he had helped build. If you just sit around eating unleavened bread and telling a story about escaping Egypt 1,000 years ago, you risk falling into mere historical nostalgia.
Just remembering the good old days.
Yeah, you become a museum exhibit of a past civilization. Akiva's edition turned the dining room table into an active engine of national hope. He is saying, yes, we are surviving in the virtual space of text right now out of necessity, but our ultimate goal is real, physical, geopolitical redemption.
He's keeping the fire of return alive.
Yeah.
But that fiery hope for physical redemption, that is exactly what eventually puts Rabbi Akiva on a direct collision course with the most powerful, brutal empire on the planet.
Indeed. The focus on future redemption was not just a theoretical dinner table prayer for Akiva, it was a geopolitical strategy. And it leads us to the final tragic and monumental chapter of his life, the Bar Kokhba Revolt, which raged from 132 to 135 CE.
Let's set the geopolitical stage here. We are about 60 years past the destruction of the temple. The Roman emperor at the time is Hadrian, and Hadrian decides he's going to solve the persistent Judean problem once and for all. What does he do to spark this?
Around 132 CE, Hadrian makes two highly inflammatory, catastrophic moves. First, he issues decrees attempting to build a pagan Roman colony directly over the sacred ruins of Jerusalem, which he plans to rename Aelia Capitolina.
Oh.
Even worse, he plans to build a temple to the Roman god Jupiter right on the site of the Jewish Temple Mount. Second, he issues severe imperial prohibitions against the practice of circumcision, viewing it through a Hellenistic lens as barbaric bodily mutilation.
So he is attacking the sacred geography and the sacred body simultaneously. It is an absolute boiling point for a population that has been praying for physical redemption every single Passover. And this sparks a massive guerrilla rebellion.
Yes. A charismatic, ruthless military leader steps up and launches a massive, highly organized guerrilla war against the Roman legions. He uses tunnel systems, ambush tactics, and widespread mobilization. This becomes the Third Jewish-Roman War.
And here's where Rabbi Akiva makes a move that stuns a lot of people reading this history. Remember, Akiva is an old man at this point. He is well into his 80s.
Right, he's elderly.
He is the preeminent rational scholar of his generation. Furthermore, he had previously traveled on diplomatic missions to Rome. He had seen the sheer size, wealth, and brutality of the Roman military machine firsthand. He knew they commanded hundreds of thousands of professional soldiers.
He knew exactly who he was dealing with.
Yet, when this rebel Shimon starts this war, Rabbi Akiva publicly throws the entire weight of his religious authority behind him.
He does more than just casually support him. He boldly provides the explicit theological backing for a total war. Akiva publicly declares that Shimon is the prophesied messianic king who will liberate the land.
The Messiah.
Yes. He applies a famous biblical verse from the book of Numbers, "A star shall step forth from Jacob," and he literally renames the warlord Bar Kokhba, which translates to the son of a star.
So you have the greatest religious mind of the era declaring that this guerrilla general is the Messiah who will physically defeat Rome. This is Akiva putting his study leads to action philosophy into its most extreme, terrifying reality. But I have to ask, how could someone so smart make such a catastrophic miscalculation?
It's a great question.
He goes from being a diplomat advocating for civil rights to backing total apocalyptic war. It's intense cognitive dissonance.
It was an all-in gamble for physical redemption, driven by the trauma of his youth and the intense messianic fervor of the time. You have to remember, Akiva saw the first temple destroyed when he was 20. Now he's in his 80s. He wants to see it rebuilt before he dies.
He's running out of time.
Exactly. And for a brief, shining moment, it actually looked like it was working. The rebels inflicted massive, unprecedented casualties on the Romans, completely wiping out at least one entire Roman legion, and they actually established an independent Jewish state for about 2.5 years. They even minted their own sovereign coins over Roman currency.
But the Roman Empire does not lose wars of attrition. They have endless resources. Hadrian is so enraged that he brings in his absolute best general, Julius Severus, all the way from Britain, and they systematically, brutally crush the rebellion.
It was an unimaginable bloodbath. The Roman strategy was total annihilation of villages and agriculture. The rebellion finally collapses catastrophically around 135 CE when the last major Jewish stronghold of Betar falls.
Where is Betar?
Betar is located near modern-day Batir, in the West Bank. Ancient historians claim the rivers ran thick with blood all the way to the sea. With that defeat, Jewish political autonomy in the land was completely erased, and it would not be restored for another 2 millennia.
And the aftermath is just draconian. Emperor Hadrian realizes that the rebellion was fueled not just by swords and tunnels, but by the theology taught in the rabbinic academies. So he goes directly after the source code. He outlaws the teaching of the texts. He outlaws the ordination of new scholars. He outlaws the observance of the Sabbath.
And this is where Akiva's story reaches its profound climax. Hadrian's ban on teaching the traditions is strictly punishable by death. But Akiva, who spent his first 40 years in total ignorance and his next 40 years painstakingly building the architectural framework of the law, absolutely refuses to stop.
He just won't give it up.
He openly flouts the imperial ban. He gathers large crowds of students and continues to teach the laws publicly.
He is basically daring the Romans to arrest him. He knows exactly what they will do, and they do it.
He is arrested by the Roman governor of Judea. He is imprisoned, and eventually he is sentenced to death for treason. The execution takes place in the coastal city of Caesarea, which is modern-day Caesarea National Park in Israel, right on the Mediterranean coast.
And the execution is not a quick, merciful beheading. It is a brutal, prolonged public torture designed to break his spirit, humiliate the scholar, and terrify the populace into submission. The ancient tradition says the Romans flayed his flesh with iron combs.
It is agonizing, unspeakable torture. But the historical texts record a moment of incredible transcendence. While he was being tortured, the dawn broke, and the time for the morning prayers arrived.
The exact time they mapped out years ago.
Yes, and Akiva, while his flesh is literally being torn from his body, ignores the Romans entirely and begins to calmly recite the Hear, O Israel prayer, the Shema, the central declaration of faith. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one.
His students who are forced to watch this horrific spectacle are utterly devastated. They cry out to him, "Rabbi, even to this extent, you are suffering so much, why are you still praying?"
And Akiva responds to them with a profound theological insight. He says, "All my life I read the biblical verse, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And I constantly wondered if I would ever have the privilege of fulfilling the command to love God with all my soul meaning, even if he takes my life. Now that the opportunity has finally come to me, shall I not fulfill it?"
Wow. That is just, wow. He is later laid to rest in Tiberias on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. But his death, it didn't break the movement like the Romans hoped. It actually did the exact opposite. It completely reframed how the survivors processed the trauma of Roman persecution.
Akiva's death established the ultimate paradigm of what is called Kiddush Hashem, the sanctification of the divine name through martyrdom. He proved in his final agonizing moments that the Romans could destroy the physical temple in Jerusalem with fire, they could crush the physical fortress of Beitar with their legions, and they could even destroy his physical body with iron combs in Caesarea. But the ultimate sanctuary wasn't a building of stone and wood. It was the unbreakable devotion of the human mind.
It was unassailable.
Right. The Romans could not touch the decentralized, virtual faith that Akiva had built in the minds of his thousands of students.
So what does this all mean for us? Let's take a step back and look at the massive journey we've just taken. We have traced a historical arc that is almost impossible to believe. We started with a 40-year-old illiterate shepherd from Lod, a guy who worked in the dirt, completely locked out of the aristocratic, wealthy, temple-centered, blood and sacrifice religion of his youth.
And we watched him use a simple, persistent drop of water on a stone as the inspiration to master a completely broken, chaotic system of oral traditions.
He built the massive academy near Tel Aviv. He created the radical legal methodology of microexegesis, treating the text like divine source code and finding entire worlds of law in a single grammatical particle.
And he organized the framework of the Mishnah, ensuring the laws would never be forgotten.
He decoupled faith from geography. He helped shift the focus from the slaughtered lamb in a burning Jerusalem to the storytelling of the Seder at your own dining room table. He backed a Messianic revolt, failed catastrophically, and yet, through his martyrdom, he made the software of Rabbinic Judaism completely indestructible.
He took a fragile, localized cult and made it a portable, text-driven civilization that could survive the mighty Roman Empire and 2,000 years of global exile.
He essentially saved his society by virtualizing it. He took their massive physical temples, their sensory sacrifices, their entire economy of worship, and he successfully downloaded all of it into text and memory. The physical hardware was destroyed, but the software ran perfectly in the minds of the people.
Which is incredible.
Which leaves us with a truly fascinating, provocative question to think about today. We look around at our modern society, and we see all these massive physical institutions. Our capitals, our financial centers, our museums, our universities. We assume they are completely, unshakably permanent. But history tells us that nothing physical lasts forever.
Everything eventually falls.
Right. So what cultural anchors or institutions in your world today do you assume are permanent, that might one day need to be entirely virtualized into text or memory just to survive the next great catastrophe?
It is a profound question about the resilience of modern civilization. Do we actually have the software to survive if our hardware is destroyed tomorrow morning?
Something deep to mull over as you go about your day. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the extraordinary life of Rabbi Akiva and the virtualization of a civilization.
Thank you for listening. Keep asking the big questions.
We will catch you on the next deep dive.